how in the world did we get to a point where the diagnosis criteria is so broad and we have all these types of people fitting under one umbrella? Like, it does not work that way with cancer. It does not work that way with cerebral palsy. It does not work that way with Down syndrome. It doesn't work that way with anything. So it's like, why are we doing it with autism?
Welcome to the Reality Therapy Podcast, where the truth will set you free.
Welcome. I'm here today with Sam Lacrosse, who's an author, podcaster, entrepreneur, and so much more. And so glad to have you, Sam. So welcome.
Dude, Ryan, I'm so enthralled that I got back for a second time, dude. I'm really excited for this, like genuinely. Like we were talking before we came on about just our converging interests on this topic, and I think this is going to be a great conversation. So I'm really honored to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. So before we're going to talk about your book for, I think, the bulk of the time here. But before we get into that, I know some people are thinking like, you know, how much of a stud is Sam exactly, like on the scale of like Chad to Giga Chad? Like, where exactly is he? And I want to tell a story. We go to the same church.
Oh boy.
And it was baptism Sunday, and I get in the grass parking lot at like 6:30 a.m. and I see a group of guys over there, like behind like the tailgate of a truck, and there's like food and energy drinks, and you're over there. You're tailgating for baptism Sunday. That's serious John the Baptist energy right there.
Dude, it is, and the only regret that I have is that your brother was not there to witness everything together. I think he was the only one of our small group that was not there, unfortunately, and he would have been a wonderful rendition to the whole thing. But no, what was the funny thing about that is that the church got content of everything, and so they got content of all this stuff. And so there is a picture of all three of our lovely pastors there with our whole ragtag group of people with the little silo cans of what look like White Claw, but is actually like canned cold brew that's caffeinated. And so it went out to something, and one of my buddies, Jorge Perez, he is like pretending to shotgun one of them in front of it, and it was like on the church's Instagram with like 30,000 followers. I'm like,
wow,
this is probably not gonna, like, this could go very not well.
Yeah.
But it proves, like, you know, and so yeah, am I going to make it on the Trad Life Instagram page? Maybe. We'll see.
Yeah.
That is this whole discussion, to be honest. But this is going to be the that was great, dude. You were there, so that made it great, and that was awesome. Great time.
I'm picturing like from the Book of Acts, like somebody comes up, are these men drunk? And like, it's 6:30 in the morning.
Yes.
Like,
no, we're praising the Lord, actually.
Yeah. That was awesome. That was actually the day after I got baptized. So that was really cool. Like it was such a electric atmosphere. So anyway, so get back on track. Spectrum of Lies by Sam Lacrosse. This is, I mean, right up my alley in terms of like diagnosing wokeness, but you have such a specific and fascinating angle that you're coming at it from. Tell me about this book.
Yeah. So, Ryan, I know you and I have known each other for a while now, like going on almost. I've known Austin, your brother, for a long time now. And so I think we've known each other just as long, if not, you know, more so. And so you might not know a little bit about my background. I think I might have talked about that a little bit when I was on here last time, but for broader context, the two biggest elements that have really changed my life and altered the way that I see the world are that I'm a Christian, and that was a relatively recent thing, coming up on 5 years of, you know, me really being into my faith. And then the thing beforehand, the thing that defined really the most of my life up until that point, and still does to a degree, is that I'm the oldest of three siblings, and my middle sibling, my sister, is pretty severely autistic. And that defined my life for the entirety of my worldview, essentially, because a lot of it was defined around, you know, my sister, her limitations, her benefits, her kind of the things that detracted from her life. And I was very involved with that community just out of necessity and out of later a love and appreciation for that community for the vast majority of my life. I ran the New York City Marathon to raise money for special needs kids, for example. I have broken my back, my body. I've done 1,000 pull-ups in a day, et cetera, to raise money for special needs children, their families, et cetera, et cetera. And so I began to notice a couple of years ago, and I know you're getting into the book now, so I tell that story in the intro about me just sitting on my couch and watching football one Saturday a couple of years ago, and I get this message from an old high school football buddy of mine, and he just says, like, and who was very involved in the volunteering aspect of everything that I was doing for organizations like Autism Speaks and the Special Olympics, and back home in Ohio, that's where I'm from. We live in Austin now, but back home in Cleveland, that's where I was from. And so he texted me this video about like just wanting to get my thoughts on it. And I said, okay, that's fine. I'll go and give him my thoughts on this. And it was this video of a young woman, probably about, a little less, in terms of age than me, probably about 20 or 21. And she was claiming to be autistic and claiming oppression off of being autistic. But yet she was not like my sister at all, who is diagnosed autistic her entire life. And she said, well, I kind of got diagnosed like 2 years ago, but then I still go out drinking on weekends, and I have I can speak in coherent sentences, for example, that are longer than like 5 or 6 words. And my sister's very intelligent, given her constraints on her biologically and physically and things like that. But I was like, okay, this girl has something wrong with her, but I do not think it's autism. And I know there's kind of a different, variation of, what people call the spectrum, which I think is a kind of a psyop in a lot of ways. We can get into that later in terms of where that comes from. I think actually is right up your alley too. But there are people that are understandably more high functioning autism, and there are people that have more low functioning autism. My sister is kind of in the lower middle range of that dynamic. But this woman was not even like high functioning Asperger's level autism. In fact, she said in the video that Asperger's was a anti-Semitic slur that was used by autistic people, because apparently the person who came up with Asperger's syndrome, which is high functioning autism for those who don't know, was a Nazi doctor or affiliated with the Nazis or something. So now apparently using the word Asperger's is anti-Semitic. And so I'm like, okay, like this is kind of spiraling very out of control in a million different directions.
Hold on, I mean, I've known like a number of people on the spectrum, and I worked at a treatment center that was predominantly for autistic people, helping them kind of get back on their feet, develop some life skills. And I think like it feels like people in that community often like that term.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, because it's just, I mean, for them, it's like, it's like saying that, like, it's just like any other phrase that you would identify someone with. I mean, it's a disability. It's kind of an immutable characteristic in that way. I mean, you can't really change it. It's just kind of part of who you are. And so, but the thing was, it's like, now that woman also said, like, Ryan, you were in that facility where you were trying to help people assimilate to the world in terms of, being inside of society. And so what this woman said, and what a lot of people on this kind of emerging element of this kind of last gasp of wokeness that's kind of at that element of everything are saying that, hey, it's kind of like appropriation or something to assimilate, because autism is just me. It's my identity. If you try to get me to like be neurotypical, quote unquote, or whatever, you are
masking
me. You are masking me. You are forcing an identity on me. All the things that we hear from the woke crowd everywhere in terms of our society. And so I said, like, okay, like what's going on here? Like, actually, and I make it very clear, like, I am not even in your lane, Ryan, in terms of you're getting licensed for this stuff. I am not a medical professional. I am not a doctor. I am not a psychiatrist. I'm not a psychotherapist. I cannot prescribe medication to anything. But I wanted to look at it from a purely cultural level. And what I had noticed is that, the autism rates have spiked recently. And I think there is a medical component to that, certainly, and there's medical factors that have that. But I also think there is more of a social and a cultural element going on as well. And I thought that that was very bizarre. And so I started looking into more of these instances of this young woman, and I found it more and more and more and more. And when I was just getting out of corporate America at this time when I was finishing this up, and I was looking at some of the corporate America policies that were around, again, neurodiversity, quote unquote, and things like that. And I was very perplexed by that. And I said, okay, let me totally go down a rabbit hole on this thing and see if this leads anywhere. And it led to the book. And it led to a very deep and dark rabbit hole that I try to expose in this book in terms of seeing where does this actually come from? Why is this an issue? And who does this victimize and affect actually, instead of the people that say that they are,
That's so fascinating. What came up for me is I had a professor who, and again, I'm not licensed yet. I'm not, perfect at spotting autism, but I've been around it quite a bit, and I think I can, identify it fairly well. I had a professor who did not strike me as autistic in any way whatsoever, and she every day she would tell us, "Oh yeah, I'm autistic. I'm on the spectrum," and she would say things like, "I don't really like hugs. Like that's what makes me autistic," and it's like.
Yeah.
What is this like? Is it social capital that people are craving? Is it some kind of authenticity?
Yeah. I think it's definitely that. That's one of the contentions that I come to. And a big way I do that is I compare it a lot to the trans issue in a way, because, You had obviously Lisa Littman that did the ROGD, rapid onset gender dysphoria paper that came out, and that was that bombshell that got her rapidly canceled and people kind of piling on her and stuff. And so and then Abigail Schreier, who is one of my favorite authors and a personal hero of mine, she wrote a great book on that called Irreversible Damage. And what she said was the reason why this ROGD stuff was affecting young, white, affluent, suburban women, young girls most specifically, is that they did not have a, diverse panacea to fall into. They weren't a different race. They weren't a different, they weren't, on the LGBTQ spectrum. So they just kind of fell into saying like, I'm a boy now and that kind of thing. And so now we've seen a backlash on that. And now I think the last people that are trying to get on this, I don't even know what to call it, like this, wild wokeness arc before the flood washes everything away. The last trend is disabilities, I think. And I think because if someone can say, because, I make the point in terms of like, if you were to get on an airplane right now and your pilot was black, you wouldn't care. Pilot was a woman, you wouldn't care. Pilot was gay, you wouldn't care. Pilot was trans, you wouldn't care. But if a pilot was mentally disabled, you might care a little bit more before getting on the plane. Like, hold on a second, like wait a minute. And so, and you wouldn't care the same way if that was a dentist, if they were any of those categories, or an accountant, or a president, or your local state representative, or your coffee shop person maybe. But you would care in most of those scenarios that person was severely mentally handicapped. And now, as I made this point in the episode I did on my show a couple weeks ago, and I previewed it. It's like we literally had a FAA regulation that encouraged airline pilots to be severely mentally and physically disabled.
What?
Dude, look it up. And there is no shock that what have we seen in the last year? Planes falling out of the sky left and right. What does that lead to? That we cannot keep the planes in the air anymore because of this stuff.
Demanding that a pilot have a certain IQ or a certain level of abilities or talent, that's ableism.
And that's exactly right. And that's what, and you know how I knew this, was for sure. So one of I think my favorite citation I've ever had in anything that I've ever done comes in the last part of this book from Lizzo. And so, you think of someone who is immune to like the cancellation mob, right? You think of a high profile, obese black woman like Lizzo in this scenario.
Yeah.
She was canceled by the ableism mob because she said one word on a song and she had it edited out of the song because she got the backlash so bad. Beyonce was the same thing inside of this. She had to go back and edit out lyrics of a song because
was it like ableist type stuff?
Well, so she said, so Beyonce, pardon my French, I'm trying to tame my tongue, but I just can't help myself. So so she said spazzing on that ass in a lyric.
Oh, spazzing is like what is that a reference to?
It's a reference to a disability called spastic, or a trait of something called being spastic. But I remember being as a kid and saying like, oh, like I'm just spazzing out, or like, oh, that guy's a spaz or whatever, thinking that guy's like kind of weird.
Yeah, I heard that all the time.
And so Beyonce is like talking about like twerking in a club or something, and then they think that that's ableism. And then Lizzo says something in a line somewhat of the same thing. I forget what she said, but I remember Beyonce specifically because it was so absurd and ridiculous and things like that. But if they were able to take those two, who were immune to everything, about as far, like literally campaigned for Kamala Harris, like did everything they could have done to kind of be on that left progressive side, and they were not far enough to that craziness to get away from the mob.
I want to go down like a little side rabbit trail here. And one of the things that I talk about in my book is how difficult it is to what I call calculating your intersectionality score. Because like you can never be 100% sure. And it's like, what is Muslim or transgender higher in this space? You're kind of constantly doing this calculation, and the way you're presenting this, like disabled is above like race and gender and all these other things. Like that's incredible.
I think so, and that's kind of the contention that I come to at the end of this is because and that's why I wanted to compare it to the trans issue as well, because for the while I think trans was like the cherry on top, like you can't get higher than trans. And then the disability mob comes in and they're like, whoop, we're going to raise that up another level and we're going to add another dollop of whipped cream on top of the cherry. And now it's about, because the interesting thing is like with all of those other immutable characteristics, even with, transgenderism and people who are trans and things like that, like that's evident physical, you can see that. And I think now that, transgender people have become more normalized into our culture via exposure and popular media and things like that, we can kind of tell like, okay, like that's a trans person. People are more open about it now. But oftentimes with disabilities, unless it's a physical disability like cerebral palsy or something, or mental retardation or Down syndrome, you can't tell if someone's autistic. And that's why I don't say disabilities are the tip of the spear. It's autism that is the tip of the spear, because autism is a quote unquote invisible disability. People, you cannot quantify your autism in that way.
And another thing, this is just kind of like unfalsifiable bits of social capital generally. So like non-binary is another one in this category. Like you can't disprove if someone's non-binary, but it's like you don't have to have like an official diagnosis from a therapist or a psychologist or a psychiatrist. You can just kind of declare yourself to be autistic, and then you get the social capital.
Well, and that's exactly right, because, I think the reason why you do not see, like, you don't see people doing like coming out TikToks for I'm mentally retarded now, or I have cerebral palsy, or I have Tourette's was another one. Tourette's is kind of another one of these like invisible ones, quote unquote. But you don't see this happening with like I'm gonna do a massive coming out video for me being paralyzed from the waist down or something. Like it's always autism. Autism is the catch-all for everything. It's now getting memed in terms of like, for example, I came on a crowd of people a couple weeks before the book was released actually talking about their quote-unquote tism. Oh, that's my tism acting up.
Yeah, I've heard that.
Yeah, when they see like if someone has like a weird, like my mother said one of the wisest things about this topic she'd ever said to me. My mom was a big inspiration behind this book because she was the person that actually alerted me to a lot of this. And so she said, Sam, have you ever noticed that no one's allowed to be just weird anymore? Or have like just a weird thing that they do, and I'm like, yeah, I have noticed that. Like I'm weird in all the different ways. Like I have like my weird like obsessions and rabbit holes that I go down and things that are just bizarre about me in general. But for this brand of person, it is not okay to just be weird. There needs to be a label attached to it. There needs to be a source code that is attached to it. And for a lot of people, more and more with this catch-all category of autism, that's what this is turning into, as far as I can see.
Fascinating. Okay. I want to switch gears real quick and just kind of play with this little rabbit hole and see if we can get anything out of it. You know who Jeffrey Miller is?
Oh, I've heard of him. I don't know.
He's an evolutionary psychologist, and he's on the spectrum himself. Like he talks about that. Yeah. But it's interesting because he says that wokeness is actually very hostile to autistic people because autistic people tend to be very literal, and wokeness is like a giant game of pretend, essentially. And I'm wondering how you see it from that angle.
Well, you'll love this. So essentially what's interesting is that autistic people who are actually on the spectrum and have like a diagnosable, like, it's very evident and apparent that they're autistic when you talk to them or get to know them and everything like that. They are actually, to Dr. Miller's point, they are very big targets of the social justice activist mob. And the biggest, I actually didn't know this until I was doing some research, and Greta Thunberg actually has talked about this before. And she is another quote unquote autistic person that is now dictating the world's climate policy. Apparently.
Yeah.
She has now kind of attached herself and glommed onto this as well. And she says that she deliberately, when she recruits like these wild activist people that go and like throw soup on paintings or whatever these crazy people do, she targets autistic people because she looks for certain characteristics and traits in autistic people in terms of like, well, they're really like, dedicated to things and they stick on to topics easier or whatever the case might be. And again, that's predatory and wrong. And, if you actually are an autistic person, you probably are looking for some type of tribe to belong to because you've been ostracized by your school, or you've been picked on, or you've been bullied or whatever. And then there comes the clutches of like the crazy climate lady from Sweden, and she's like, hey, you can throw soup at a painting too. And we'll all be straight and narrow on the other side here. So yes, that's very accurate.
Oh, man, this makes me very angry, but just to flesh this out more, I was reading, I forget who it was, talking about how so many, particularly younger autistic females, have so much trouble fitting in, and just like finding your social clique is so difficult to navigate. I mean, it's difficult for a normal 13-year-old, much less, if you're autistic, that's like a huge challenge.
Yeah.
And then you dip a toe. If this was talking about you dip a toe into the non-binary space or the trans space, and you get love bombed, and you think, thank God, finally I have some group that's accepting me. And before you know it, you're pumped full of hormones and you chop your breasts off. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And it seems like it's like that with the social justice movement broadly. These people, and not just autistic, but specifically there in this case, they're having trouble fitting in, and you find this group of people who are like willing to accept you and love bomb you, and ultimately make you do crazy things.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think this is a common misconception because really the first part of the book is just talking about what autism actually is and the history of autism and what it actually comprises. Because I had a lived experience of it. My sister was autistic, and I've been around disabled people my entire life, mostly autistic people in a wide variety of circumstances. But I really wanted to say, I want to understand this. I want to know what this actually is. And so what a common misconception that I've fallen into myself, even being, again, a sibling of someone who is pretty severely autistic, is that autism is primarily an intellectual disorder. And it's not, because autism is primarily an emotional and a social disorder. Like, for example, there is a reason why in the panacea of autism diagnoses, you have people of incredibly high intelligence that are very high functioning with Asperger's, for example. And even my sister, who's pretty cognitively impaired just because of the way that her brain works, she's placed in like the 99th percentile in things like typing speed and sorting ability and things like that. Like, I mean, she's incredibly skilled and much smarter than I am in a lot of different ways. She's incredibly emotionally intelligent as well. But it's the emotional regulation, it's the social relatability in terms of being in unfamiliar environments and things like that really trip up a lot of autistic people, which is why I'm not shocked at that data about young girls at all, because to your point, young girls are already on pins and needles about where do I fit in, how do I fit in, how do I make people like me, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then you throw an autism diagnosis on top of that, where that gets, again, just blown to bits in terms of like, I don't know where anything is and I don't know how to do this or whatever. That totally makes sense to me, because just by the data and by the diagnosis criteria, that makes all the sense in the world. At least I think it does.
Can you touch on like a little bit more? You talked about it a little bit, the expansion of the diagnostic criteria.
Yeah.
Because it seemed like I don't know, maybe a couple generations ago, it was only like debilitating, severe.
Yeah.
They got diagnosed, and now it's people who mostly get by in life that might have like something minor that are getting put in that category. It seems like a very broad category right now.
Yeah, well, and that's why the book is titled the way it is, and that's why I was very deliberate about the way I titled it, which is Spectrum of Lies. And the subtitle is How Autism, Narcissism, Obscurity, and Social Justice Are Collectively Disabling America. And the way that I break up the book is I take each one of those in 5 parts. I structured it in the way that I'm a big, obviously I have disagreements with them, but I'm a big fan of the way Douglas Murray writes his books. And so I took a lot from Madness of Crowds in terms of the way that he separated up into 4 big parts. I'm a fan of that book as well. Yeah. And so I did 5 big chunks of kind of how to dive into this. And that was a big question for me as well. Like, how in the world did we get to a point where the diagnosis criteria is so broad and we have all these types of people fitting under one umbrella? Like, it does not work that way with cancer. It does not work that way with cerebral palsy. It does not work that way with Down syndrome. It doesn't work that way with anything. So it's like, why are we doing it with autism? And the answer to that comes from a woman by the name of Judy Singer, who I think is the most underrated villain in the whole autism saga. So Judy Singer was a woman from Australia. Her family immigrated from, I believe, Eastern Europe after the Holocaust. She's a Jewish immigrant to Australia. And she grows up and she gets, I believe, put on the autism spectrum around, like, she gets diagnosed, or no, her daughter actually is diagnosed with autism in like the 1980s. And she was a computer person, but then she pivots into what would later become known as disability studies. And she does a lot of work in terms of how do I make and square this circle. And she comes out with a bombshell paper and a thesis in college for her graduate degree called Odd People In, which was later re-released as a book called Neurodiversity, The Birth of an Idea. And so this was the woman who birthed the neurodiversity movement. And so how she was able to do this was by leveraging one of your favorite people, Herbert Marcuse, and by saying that his work and a lot of feminist research, which is what she primarily draw on, Marxist literature and feminism, to build a army of abnormal people, essentially was what she said. And she wanted to expand and overthrow this kind of, again, oppressive, neurotypical branch so that autistic people can have more access to services and things like that by basically expanding the diagnosis criteria of autism via something called the quote-unquote spectrum. Because to your point, autism had a very fixed criteria before the spectrum was enabled, because people had to fit in a certain medical diagnosis. But what Judy Singer did, was she took autism from a medical diagnosis to an identity group. She moved it from the medical to the political. And so the reason she was able to do that was by creating this thing called the spectrum. And now, I have to thread this needle. Do I think that there are different types of people, because autism is a mental disorder in a lot of ways, or it is in terms of a disability, and can that manifest differently in different types of people? Of course it can, because people are different, personalities are different, no person is the same. But to say that a spectrum, quote unquote, is the reason for everybody just falling on this number line of how autistic you are, that was not a thing, because that's not a mental diagnosis. How can you diagnose someone based off that criteria? And to this point now where we're at, how can you tell someone that you're maybe not autistic, you're kind of just weird in this scenario? You maybe have like some of this or whatever actually. And so the reason why that happened was primarily because of Judy Singer. And so Singer took this and ran with it. It became this bombshell intellectual paper, and you can buy it on Amazon. I read this whole thing. And if you really want to get mind blown about how, big this was and how corrupt this all got, that's a great place to start, because this woman did a remarkable amount of damage with what she was able to do with this one book. So that was where I'd start with kind of how did this get so out of control, overblown, and kind of crazy at that point.
I mean, I had a short section in my book about disability studies, but you're just like blowing my mind right now. And I'm thinking back to like Herbert Marcuse, and his whole deal is like, we're going to create an army of the underclass, like black people and drug addicts and schizophrenics. We're like, this kind of, he feels very dehumanizing when he's reading it, just like the dregs of society. We'll make them our legions kind of. And it seems like she's doing that with like people on the spectrum and different types of disability. Like it feels very dehumanizing. Like, I don't actually view you as, like, taking it from medical to political, I don't actually view you as, some suffering person that I want to give care to. You're a pawn in my big political game.
Yeah, well, that's exactly right. And it is dehumanizing. I didn't even think about it that way, but it certainly is. And, because what she essentially, I don't know if she outright said this, but she was pretty close to, in at least some areas, where she said, I want to create, like that army quote, like that was almost a literal take from text definition of kind of what she wanted to do. She wanted to create a mass revolutionary group of these, cast aside people in terms of, disabled folks, particularly autistic folks, and make those a member of a cultural uprising revolutionary movement sort of thing, so that they would overthrow the neurotypical regime or whatever she wanted to call it at that point. So yeah, I mean, it's using autistic people as pawns to get what she wants politically. And which is why I like to say, and I make this clear in the dedication, is that there is no group that is more harmed by this, as I would assume most all woke revolutions are, than the people that they are supposedly advocating for. Like, the number one group of people that has suffered because of this movement are actually autistic people and disabled people generally. Like, people who actually have a severe affliction of autism, of disabilities broadly, that is who is most affected by this. But do people like Judy Singer care about that? I don't think so at this point. I see no evidence of that.
So there's got to be some motivation here. If autistic people are not the winners, who are the winners?
I think it's people like Judy Singer. And I think that's really what I wanted to say at the end of the book, is that the people that cling to, I think, any woke ideology, whether it's like, this, race Marxism or whatever all this stuff is that we've seen over the past kind of 12 years. Michael Schellenberger, I think, had the perfect categorization of this when he was on Jordan Peterson's podcast a couple of months ago, where he said we've lived through kind of a woke reign of terror. And I think that's right, actually. Like, I think that's very right, especially if you look at the French Revolution and how that kind of went down. I think he's absolutely right about that. And so the people that stand to gain, I think, from this disability advocacy, quote unquote, or this disability Marxism, are people who largely are unimpressive, and people who can provide no value to society, who are unskilled, they don't have merit in anything, they don't really have a special skill or something they can provide to the market, they can't show their worth to people. And I think that's really at the bottom of the brainstem what all of this woke stuff is. I am not good enough, I do not feel good enough, so I'm going to use a part of myself as a weapon against someone else who has something. Like, I'll never forget when Dr. Peterson came back from being his illness when he was addicted to benzodiazepines a couple of years ago. And he came on and he was very sick, and he just had released his second book, or his Beyond Order book. It's not his second book, but his book After 12 Rules for Life.
Yeah.
And his first podcast he did was with Dave Rubin, and him and Dave Rubin are really good friends, and he took them out, everywhere. And I remember Dr. Peterson I almost started crying when I started watching it, because Jordan Peterson is maybe the biggest hero of my entire life. And he looked so awful, and he was so sick, and he could barely look like he could sit up. And I remember that, because, Dave asked him, because, Jordan Peterson, I think, essentially missed all of the summer of love of 2020. He missed the first couple of years of the Biden administration where this was crazy. And so Dave kind of asked him, he's like, what do you think is going on here? Like, what do you think actually is all of this? And I'll never forget his answer to that question. He said, I think it's a war on competence. And that really stuck with me. And I was like, well, what does that mean? So the woke revolution, the woke reign of terror that we just realized, is a war against people that actually do things and build things and create things and provide value to society. It is a kind of a revolution of the loser class against the people who they deem as winners. You see this a lot with the incel literature. You see this a lot with all of the oppressor-oppressed narratives. And in actuality, I was listening to Dave Ramsey was on Chris Williamson's podcast a couple weeks ago, and he said, there's this misconception about rich people. That rich people have had to step on a bunch of people and all these, greedy CEOs or whatever. He's like, that's not my experience at all. Most rich people, you have to be nice in order to get wealthy, or else because people think you're a jerk, they're not going to do business with you. They're not going to buy from you. They're not going to do everything else. And so it's a misconception that the people who are on the top of some kind of a status hierarchy have gotten there via malicious means. And it is a game of bitterness. It is a game of resentment. It is a game of envy. It is a game of jealousy. And people use some facet of their personality they can't control because they don't want to look at what they can control, which is how do I bring value to a certain thing, whatever that thing is. And they don't want to confront that. And I think that's kind of really especially manifested in disability literature, because disability literally means not able. So if you're going to hit that at the very baseline of everything else, and I talk about a lot about this when I talk about religion a lot, especially in the narcissism chapter, about why they're actually picking this version of it to go with. I talk a lot about the study of narcissism, which I thought was really fascinating. And I think that's really the root of what everything is at the end of the day.
You brought up religion. Something just came to me, and I've toyed around with the concept of comparing wokeness to a religion, but it hit me in a new way when you're just talking there about this kind of warped version of Christianity. Jesus says, whatever you do unto the least of these, you've done unto me. Yeah. And it's kind of like taking that and be like, well, then we should all be as incompetent as possible. We should all have as little talent as possible and as little accomplishment as possible, so that we can all be
Yeah, it's poverty gospel in a way, and not just in a sense of monetary gain. To your point, it's saying that, well, if I'm just an impotent, shrimpy, nice guy, whatever type person, then, I should be entitled to this thing. And so, well, Jesus is going to love me anyway, so what's the point of lifting weights? What's the point of developing my social skills, of dressing well, of, reading my Bible, of doing this? If Jesus is going to love me anyway, then people should love me for who I am, and that's just it. But that's not what Jesus says. That is a distortion, that is a warping of the gospel to a kind of broader scale of poverty, not just a monetary poverty, but of a spiritual poverty, of personal development poverty, of a self fulfillment poverty in terms of being the best person that you can be to achieve the things that you want to achieve. And I think that's what this is, because at the end of it, I think the solution to wokeness, the solution to this kind of war on disability advocacy, is for competent people to step up and to do the things that they need to do to provide for people, and therefore spread that to other people. And I like to say, my epilogue on this is that my sister has worked very hard to get to where she is. She was at a point we didn't think she was going to be able to be remotely by herself. We thought she was going to be either living with my parents for her entire life or in a very monitored group home setting. She's now largely gotten out of that. She's in a very kind of a mid-maintenance assisted living facility out by where we live up in Cleveland. And I look at that and I think that that's a miracle. But because competent people had to design that, they had to make the rules for that, they had to design all the buildings, they had to design the structure of the staffing policies. And if we don't have competent people doing that work, if we don't have people that are putting themselves in the position to bless other people through that, then my sister doesn't have a chance. Then people like my sister don't have a chance. That actually disabled people who have actual real hardship to overcome, who have been actually victimized due to biology or something like that, they have no chance.
You know, in my book, when I was quoting some of those disability studies theorists, there kept coming up this concept that, like, you know, if a deaf person, you know, they should never get cochlear implants because that's erasing the identity of someone. Yes. And it's similar with, you know, different, like being in a wheelchair or, you know, all different kinds of things. And autism was included in that. Uh-huh. You know, if you help someone overcome their struggles in any way, somehow you're a stooge of neoliberal capitalism and you're being ableist. Yeah. And it's like nowhere in their mind do they think, maybe this person wants help overcoming these things. Maybe they don't want to be dependent. That just blows my mind.
Well, and it is, well, I mean, I think what we need to say there is that, you know, it is mind-blowing because I think at the end of the day, all disabled people want, just like any other person wants, whether they're a different race, a different sexuality, a different religion, different whatever, is that they want acceptance. They want community. They want to be a part of something. And what I've seen from being a part of that community for my entire life is that really, when you get down to it, like go to a Special Olympics event and tell me that you're not the happiest person you've been in the last 6 months after going to something like that. Like my sister, for example, she did a special needs cheer league where obviously like they gave away like trophies to everybody and things like that. And it was like, but it was a cool thing to see these young women, these girls who had no chance of making a cheer team and no chance of getting out there and putting on a sparkly cheer outfit and getting in front of people and people clapping for them. And there's loud music and there's the bass going in the background and stuff. It's like, I mean, like that's awesome. That's great. And what people want is they want acceptance of that. They don't necessarily want to be the same as everybody else because I really don't think at the end of the day, anybody wants to be the same as everybody all the time anyway. I mean, like I like that Ryan is the way Ryan is and I like the way that I am the way I am. Like I like myself actually. But I think what a lot of people see is they think that it's quote unquote erasing a part of themselves. It's like, well, why do you want to be the same as everyone else? Like, why are you erasing yourself by saying that in the inverse? And I think that that's a real kind of self-own on their part in terms of they can't own their own differences. So they need to tear down everyone else for their own differences. And I think it's the same with the deaf person example is a great example of that. It's like, well, what are we going to do? Like, I mean, the person just not going to be able to hear? Like, I mean, come on. I mean, like, that's stupid. It's dumb.
Yeah. So I want to get into like a little of a nuance of how to approach the autistic thing, just kind of get your perspective on it. And I've heard people call this masking. So a lot of autistic people, you know, when I first started working with autistic people, you start to think like this person's really rude. This person's being really rude to me. You feel that a lot. Like, why is this person attacking me? And then you realize they have a very different communication style. There's lots of subtle niceties that you kind of soften your sentences with, you know, that autistic people like never learned to do. And so they just kind of say things bluntly. And what they're doing is like being pretty straightforward. But how most people interpret that is like, you're being rude to me. Do you think it's a good idea to teach people to like speak a different way or just kind of be yourself? Like, what's your stance on that?
I think that really the biggest thing with that I've noticed in terms of, you know, because to your point, it's like if you've never worked with disabled people, if you've never run around disabled kids or been in like a special ed classroom or something, like it is kind of a very intimidating experience. Like I remember like even like my football buddies back home who were like the tough guys, the jocks, whatever. I wasn't one of those, but I was kind of a very subpar football player in high school, but like the people who were really good about it and I invited them to partake in all of these events and stuff, like they would come to me in fear before these events and they'd say like, dude, like I'm way out of my depth here. Like, what do I do? And I'm like, dude, just be yourself and be who you are and, you know, just talk to them. And, you know, I remember like at one point my neighbor told me once, and she was a relatively nice woman for most of the time that I knew her. And she's like, you know, I really appreciate how normally you speak with your sister. And I said, well, how else am I supposed to speak with her? Like, what do you mean by that? And so I didn't know how to answer that question. But, you know, what I did was that at the end of it, I essentially, what I tell people all the time is that you need to be prepared for the communication style to be different. It's not going to be like talking to a person that is non-disabled in that regard. But don't mask who you are and don't ask them to mask who they are. Like, just come as you are to the entire conversation, and don't say, well, don't talk to me that directly or else I'm going to get like offended by this. Like, maybe just say like, okay, this is the way that the person talks. Like, just treat it as the way the person talks. And like, and that's maybe easier for me to say since I've been around it for so long, and I've seen every type of person under the sun, from people who have like hit me in the face the first time they saw me to people who have like just kind of, wanted to hug me as soon as they first saw me. Like, it's very different. And that's the interesting thing and the unique thing about dealing with autistic people, to your point, is, and from your experience probably as well, is that nobody is the same, just like any person isn't the same. You have to learn for the person. And so in terms of masking, I know there's a pressure from both autistic people and from non-autistic people to kind of, I think it's a lot like maybe code switching for African Americans or black people, like that, when they say like, I need to like act more white or whatever it is to somebody else. It's like, man, I want you to be yourself, and I want you to kind of act like the way that you want to act and talk the way that you want to talk. Like, I'm not going to judge you any other specific type of way or whatever, but if you don't really understand why they're communicating something, like, make an effort to understand, be understanding of that. But I wouldn't say like try to be something that you're not, because I think that the one thing about autistic people is that they're remarkably perceptive in ways that you often don't really notice. My sister is a lot like this. And so, my sister has dealt with a lot of very serious emotional dysregulation, to the point of like, she self-harmed a lot as a child. She would bite herself all the time, scratch herself. She has scars all up and down her hands and her arms and stuff. But what the one thing that she was able to do is that she's able to tell specifically how a person is feeling and why they're feeling that way, especially if she knows you very well. Like, I noticed this with like my grandparents, I noticed this with my mom, I noticed this with me. Like, whenever I was really agitated or angry or whatever, she knew exactly how to stick the knife in to make it worse, or she knew exactly how to make me feel better in that way too, where she would basically, and she would do that all the time with everybody. And so what I would say to someone is like, don't just assume that the person you're talking to who is disabled doesn't understand what you're saying at a deeper emotional, psychological level, because they might, and they can probably tell that. And I think that's really, honestly, the cool thing about getting to know someone in that demographic of people, is that they're able to have those type of conversations.
Awesome. So you mentioned very early in the conversation, this might be a psyop. You just kind of said it, and I'm wondering if you could dig into that a little bit.
Yeah. So I think the main thing I was alluding to was the spectrum. I think the spectrum is a lot of a psyop in terms of really what it constitutes and what it did to kind of, again, transition autism from the medical to the political, in terms of get that area down. And then I think too, we've kind of noticed this Trojan horsing of this in the mainstream. Like I said earlier with Greta Thunberg, like, the woman who basically dictates our world climate policy is like the most well-known autistic in the entire world. She was named, her and Malala Yousafzai were named the two of the first most influential people of Gen Z. Like, that's a pretty big deal. Like, I mean, there can be, this kind of mainstreaming of disability into things like DEI policies and things like our current politics, everything like that. It's kind of this slow creep of an op that's kind of going into everything else, in terms of saying like, hey, this is normal now, so don't question it and shut up. And I think that's going to be where, like, I mean, if we want to get real practical about it, I talk a little bit at the end of the book, like, our president was disabled for the last 4 years in terms of
Biden.
Joe Biden's acuity.
Yeah.
Like, we have a disabled president that was the most powerful person in the world.
And it was pretty severe.
It was very severe.
Yeah.
And like, I'll never forget when, on the eve of the election, Joe Rogan had John Fetterman into his studio to talk to him. John Fetterman cannot talk without assistance from a screen, and doing that kind of, and I think he has a hearing implant or something that he uses to transcribe words and stuff. But that was a big thing in John Fetterman's campaign. Like, when Dasha Burns, who's a reporter for NBC News, tried to question him on this, are you mentally fit to serve? Shut up, you ableist. Dr. Oz, when he said, when he was, because he was going against John Fetterman in that Senate campaign in Pennsylvania, when he basically said, hey, I don't think John Fetterman can debate because he just had a stroke and his IQ and his brain shut down for a second. Shut up, ableist. Joe Biden, mental acuity. Shut up, ableist. Michael Knowles from the Daily Wire got kicked off of Fox News. Fox News, a quote-unquote conservative.
Wait, I don't remember. When did that happen?
It was happening, I think, around maybe a year after the whole Greta Thunberg thing started to pop off. And the reason why he got kicked off of Fox News, Greta Thunberg is mentally disabled. She's autistic. We should not take her seriously. And Fox News, a quote unquote conservative news network, pulled him from being on Fox News. That's how deep this is sunk.
Wow. Do you, I mean, there's definitely, I'm thinking of like Jeffrey Miller came up earlier, but there's definitely extremely high IQ autistic people who I would not feel comfortable saying this, you shouldn't take this person's view seriously. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah. No, I think it's like, it's a complicated thing because, again, it's like, I am a very large, I mean, Ryan, we were talking about our church earlier. It's like, I mean, I was, I volunteer in our special needs ministry. I thank Stephanie Matad, who runs our special needs ministry, in the end of the book, in the acknowledgement section. And I do that for a reason, because the work around disability advocacy and when done in the proper context, I think is very important. And it's very important that we do that. But there needs to be a boundary drawn by saying that you cannot cross at this point. This does not, one of these things is not like the other type of thing. And there has not been that, which I think has led to this metastasization of disability kind of blanket diagnoses sorts of things. And an example that I like to say often is me. So, for example, like my sister was diagnosed from a very early age, like when she was an infant. So she's basically been autistic her entire life. And I remember there was this one point that I think I might have been writing the book at this point when my mom told me. I was maybe talking to her about something that I was writing. I was like, oh my gosh, this thing's crazy. And she told me the story of, she got called in one day. My siblings are all very close in age. My sister is about 15 months younger than I am. My brother's less than 3 years younger than I am. So we were pretty packed in there in terms of our age brackets. And so we had already known that my sister Jackie was autistic by this point, and we get pulled in by the school physician, the school psychologist, something. And we went to a public school, so this wasn't like a fancy, like, whatever, like doctor analysis thing, whatever. And so we get pulled in there, and the physician tells my mother, Mrs. Lacrosse, we got some unfortunate news. And she's like, oh my gosh, like, what's going on? Like, is everything okay? And she's like, well, we unfortunately think your oldest son is autistic. And she's like, and she burst in tears. She's like, oh my God, what's wrong with him? And you know what the guy said?
What?
He said, we think Sam is autistic because he puts his trains in a straight line. And all the other kids play with his trains in a very haphazard fashion. So because your son likes to play with the trains attached in a straight line with the magnets that kind of are designed for, we think that he is an autistic person. And my mom said, for lack of a better term, F you, and she left. But this is the sinister thing. What if my mom had listened to him? What if my mom had listened to him? Then I would be severely set back in life. I would not be talking to you. I guarantee you I wouldn't be talking to you. And this is happening with parents, particularly with poor people, with single mothers, with the disadvantaged groups who have no idea what is going on here. This is happening to people. We are misdiagnosing thousands upon thousands, I believe, of young children in already bad scenarios, most likely, because the old saying, when the rich catch the poor, the poor dies, or when the rich catch cold, the poor die of pneumonia. It's the same thing here. It's like this is bankrupting families. This is putting families in severe relational trouble. Autistic divorce rates are above 85% in some cases. It's very huge. Like my mom and dad should not have made it, but they made it because they were strong and they stuck together and they did the whole thing together. But this is causing a lot of damage and a lot of pain to children, to families, to mothers, to fathers, to financial situations across the country. And it's very harmful what has been allowed to happen. And it's a real shame. It really is.
So you mentioned our church, and I think our church, does an incredible job with their special needs ministry. Stephanie Matad gave like a mini sermon this last week. I came up and told her, she made me cry twice. It was really powerful for me. There's a number of special needs people that I'm sure who are regulars in the lobby that just, to me, are just incredible.
They serve there. They serve at the church.
Yeah, a lot of them do serve at the church. I mean, it's like my little rays of sunshine, really. It's just like it warms my heart to hang out with these people. Yeah. What are, we talked about like the disability side, the negative, the downside of these type of things. What are like the positives?
Yeah. Well, I think, and I think Stephanie, this is maybe her superpower when it comes to working with this population of people, is that, and she quotes this, I believe from Second Corinthians, it's from the book Corinthians. I think it's the Second Corinthians, maybe chapter 2, I think, where she says the parts of the body of Christ that people perceive as weak are actually the strongest parts of it. And I believe that to be true. And I think Stephanie has made that the mission statement of our ministry in times of special needs, where we are missing a very important group of the church when special needs people are not included in that, and they don't feel welcome to come there. And I remember specifically growing up, I was raised Catholic, and I got confirmed and did all the sacraments and things like that. Obviously, I don't identify as a Catholic anymore. I'm in a Southern Evangelical church and non-denominational, whatever you want to call it. And but I remember, in terms of how exclusive it was, just because, and that wasn't necessarily, this is not like a blame the Catholic Church argument, but it's just the way that the church operated, because it's very quiet, it's very regimented, it's very structured, it's very kind of like you can't, go around and dance or sing or worship or anything else like that. And it's not really conducive to a family, especially a young family with young disabled children, because that's just not the way that most of them can assimilate very well to a culture of people. And so I think the positives, and I talk about this a lot in the book, at least I try to, is that disabled people, when you really get to know them, especially with children or especially with young adults, they are the most pure people that you will ever meet in your entire life. There is no BS. There is no faking anything. There is no I'm trying to be something that I'm not. They're just the way that they are, and they're kind of cool with it, which is awesome, because a lot of people, myself included, are battling a lot of insecurities, and they try to put it by front to get people to like them or to say this about them or whatever. And with disabled people, it's like, man, this is me. Like I'm going to be me. I'm going to do me. This is who I am. And I like me. I like me. And like my sister has no concept of like, I'm going to try to make myself look cool to this specific person. My sister is my sister. And I think that's the wonderful thing, the refreshing thing about working in that population and with that population of people, is that they remind me that all of the things we do to quote unquote mask ourselves, to use your term earlier, it's like, man, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. They're so refreshing. I mean, I don't know. Were you at Night to Shine at our church?
No, I tried to sign up. It was full.
Okay, it was full. So honestly, dude, if there's an action item for someone else, go to one of those events at your local church.
I'm going to sign up early next year.
Dude, go volunteer from somewhere. Like, the amount of joy in that room was unbelievable.
So jealous.
It was unbelievable. And no one was looking like, because I hate dancing, because I think I'm going to look like an idiot and I'm going to look stupid and like this girl's going to laugh at me, even though like none of that's going to happen. But with these folks, it's like they don't care. They want to have fun. They want to be a part of something. They want to do something that's awesome. And I think what we can learn from that population is like, man, especially in a church setting, it's like, dude, come as you are. Come as you are. Don't try to think that by being something outside of who you are, that you're going to be seen any differently than you are. Because if you're in the right setting with people that are coming at you from a right perspective, it's like, man, that's like, they're the most unafraid people. They're the most unashamed people. They're the most just pure people. Like I said, like I see so much of God's love in that demographic of people. They are God's, like when you talk about God's chosen people, it's like, man, it doesn't get much better. It really doesn't. It really doesn't. Because when you see that smile of like a little girl who's never been inside of a classroom setting before, and she, and what's really cool about what I get to do is that now we're kind of working at getting some of our kids into the bigger rooms. I don't know if you've ever been back into our kids ministry before, but there's rooms for different age groups, and like kindergarten, pre-K, and elementary, and babies and things like that. Like now we see like Stephanie's kids, for example, like her oldest son is now friends with a couple of the little boys that I work with inside of special needs, and they hang out outside of everything. And so now they're a part of something, and you get to see these kids can say like, okay, this kid looks a little bit different than me, maybe, or maybe acts a little bit different than me, or maybe kind of has like raises his voice a little bit or something, but they're learning to socialize and they're becoming friends. And that's what I think we can learn, is that they bring a sense of purity. They bring a sense of emotional availability. They bring a sense of joy about themselves that I think is very absent from our culture today, particularly from our young people who are so desperately trying to fit into something. And I think that's a really big advantage for anyone who wants to take a part of it.
Let me tell you, there's been multiple times in the lobby of our church where I'll be up in my head about money issues or career issues or dating issues, and I'm spinning out of control. And one of these like special needs people come up and give me a hug, and I just start crying, because I may have a certain like cognitive ability for something, but like in that moment, that person has a way better understanding of the world than I do.
Well, but they don't care about that though. That's the thing too. It's like, all like, oh my God, I'm worried about this. I'm worried about that. Like, hey, I want a hug.
Yeah.
Like, give me a hug. Like, and I was like, okay, like, I'll give you a hug. And so, and two, like, I think the sense of like, I remember my dad, and my dad is like he's so funny. I'm turning more into him as I age, which is both a good thing and a bad thing. Well, mostly a good thing because I love my dad. But my dad is a very stoic, non-emotional. Like, I've seen him cry maybe 3 times in my entire life. Like, it's a whole where it's like, wow, like that's a big thing. And what I've noticed is that, and I've seen this with my parents, and I've seen this with other parents, is that they absorb a lot of the emotional toll that having an autistic child or a disabled child has, just to bear. It's a big weight to carry because they need a lot more support. They need, like, your life revolves around your child because of necessity oftentimes. And when I've gotten to know a lot of our families quite well, particularly one family in particular, and there has been like the sense of relief that they were able to do from just not being away from their child because they love their child. But these people can't get a break, man. Sometimes these parents can't get a break. And, the mother in particular has come up to me multiple times in tears, like you just said earlier, like, thank you for loving my son so much. Thank you for allowing us to spend time with Jesus. Thank you for allowing us to go to church and doing all those things. And, I get to, and I carry a bunch of things in terms of like, again, like, did this girl respond to me on Hinge or whatever stupid thing I'm worried about or whatever the thing might be. And I go in and I have a kid that goes in and is like, hey, I want to use every single item in this room to build a fort. And I want to show my mom that we have used every single item in this room to build a fort. And I don't care about your dating life. I don't care about your, how much, whatever, all the, like, all the things you're doing after this. Like, I really don't care. I want to build a fort with all of these things right now. And you are going to help me do that. I say, okay, I'm going to help you do that. That is the biggest thing.
So I took this off the shelf behind me. This is a birdhouse, and it was made by one of the special needs people at our church. And like, she gave this to me, and I was just like, my heart just melted. It made me so happy.
Dude, it's amazing. Like, it really is, dude. And it's like, there's a, and it just reminds you, it's like, the things we think are so big in life are actually so stupid in so many ways. Like, they're just so minuscule. They're so dumb. And like, we all fall victim to that too. Like, I certainly do. And I've been around the population for my entire life. And, I go around, like, when my sister wants to hang out, like, we go to this, I get her the same present every single year when we go back for Christmas. You go out for a date when I go back home. And I take my sister out, like, we went to go see, like, Wicked, and my sister wanted to leave halfway through because it was so long. And then we went to, and she only wants popcorn at the movies anyway, so we just downed a bunch of popcorn. And then we went to get burgers and fries and milkshakes and things like that afterwards. And it's like, normally when you take a girl on a date, it's like, and you've gotten to know her for a long time, like, they might want to go someplace fancy. They might want to go someplace where there's like, a table mat or something down, or like a cloth on the table that you use to reuse or whatever. But it's like, no, my sister just wants to hang out with me and go see a musical in the theater with a sing-along thing on the bottom where it bounces and stuff. And she wants to get like burgers and fries and milkshakes and hang out and then go watch cartoons when we watch home or get home and go to bed by 8 o'clock. That's what she wants. And it's like, it just shows you, it's like, that's what life is about. It's not about anything that's, like, what did Trump do this week? What did Biden do last week? What is the thing? What's in the big, beautiful bill? Like, she doesn't care. She just doesn't care.
We started off this conversation about kind of how nefarious this plot is by social justice activists. And we finished it by like, there's a very real human cost here. And like, I think you and I have seen like that humanity, and I think that's why it pisses me off so much. And I sense it's similar with you. It's like, these aren't pawns on a chessboard. Like, these are like very human beings who have feelings and lives.
Yeah, it's and that's I had to be real careful with that because when the second I got that video from my friend where we started out this conversation in terms of when I found out how deep this thing was, it really bothered me. Like I had a real righteous anger about it the entire time that I was writing about it almost. But I didn't want it to be like an angry book. I didn't want it to have that tone. I wanted it to be balanced. But what I say inside of the book is that I will like hell hath no fury. If you are taking advantage of this group of people, you will have to deal with me. And you will have to deal with this book. You will have to deal with the way that I conduct myself around people. And if you ever attempt to grift onto this thing or try to make money off of it or whatever, I will tear you to pieces. I will absolutely tear you to pieces, because to your point, people are being hurt by this. And I am of the opinion, and there's been a lot of really horrible things that have happened inside of the world. The one thing I think that has been constant throughout all of the horrible events in world history is that every one of them has involved disabled people getting treated like garbage. Wow. Every single one. Every single one of them. The disabled get trodden upon. They lose first every single time, because they, go back to the olden times. So when there was no air conditioning or technology, if you were born with a disability, you starved. If you were, getting drafted into the military and you were weak, you were sent to the front lines and killed. Spartans threw disabled children off cliffs.
It's like the canary in the coal mine. Like, we're talking about, you see one of these type of people and they give you a high five and you're just like, your heart gets happy. If you're not having that response and you're saying, I don't care about this person, like you're already losing your own humanity. And like, it's a quick, procession to any kind of other atrocity from that point.
Exactly. And I think that there's a real thing we have to recognize with all this stuff. And I think that that's where, like, for example, like a lot of the organizations now have been completely corrupted by this whole ideology of transableism and all this kind of stuff that really happens with everything. But, there is a place for that sort of thing and for disability advocacy and things like that. And there are organizations that do a great job in terms of, making sure that's available to people. And what I would say to everyone is, like, we need to look out for these folks. We need to help these folks and do things for these folks to make sure that they live good lives. But we cannot overstep and do something that robs them of who they actually are or that puts them at a disadvantage. Like, we cannot go so far in either direction. We just need to treat them as you would our neighbors or a people of a different race or people of a different sexual orientation or people of a different religious background or something. People are people. And even if they have less ability, like I cannot do math, for example. That, and so, like, I would not want someone to treat me differently because I cannot do a math equation inside of my head. And that's just different types of minds. That's what Temple Grandin said about autism. It's just different types of minds. And we should be accommodating for different types of minds. However, that does not mean that they should be teaching calculus at MIT. We need to draw that line as well.
Yeah. So I got two final questions for you. And the first is, with this autism, disability, that whole conversation, we've seen how it goes very wrong and how it can really be abused. How do we get back on track?
I think it needs to start with recognizing that, again, this is a demographic of people that has a severe, in some ways, or severe, maybe not so severe. It could be dependent on whether you see it and what context it's in. But these people are different than everybody else, and we need to accommodate for them. But also, it's not saying that we need to just shove them off to the side of society. Like, what I think is really awesome, what I've seen with my sister and with a lot of her friends, are that there is a way for people like that to contribute, because the unemployment rate is sky high. The community engagement rate is very, very low for these folks. And so there is now a lot of opportunity, I think, for people with disabilities to engage in community activity and to be a part of a company or to be a part of a church or to be a part of a social fabric or something. And I think we need to be encouraging of that. And I think the one, optimistic thing that I'm seeing across all demographics of people is that, I haven't seen, and maybe I'm not as I'm in the lobby as you are in terms of where you are at the church, but like, I've never seen someone like raise a fuss about like, them seeing someone with like the welcome sign, like, oh my gosh, hey, come into church, like at the lobby. Like, I don't want to see that person. Like, I've never seen, like, I think when people get to know these folks, it's like they really like being around them. And so it's just making that more a part of the normal functioning of day-to-day life. That does not mean that we're going to make them in charge of the nuclear codes. That does not mean all those type of things. But in terms of, can this person do maybe a mid-low skill labor job, for example, in a manufacturing plant? Sure. Could they maybe do some data entry somewhere? Could they serve as a barista? Yes, I think so. And so it's about training, it's about advocacy, it's about getting these people inside of positions where they can thrive. Because at the end of the day, like, I think they're no different from any other human beings in terms of their base desire to want to be a part of a group of friends, to have a job, to provide, to work, to be a part of something bigger than themselves. Because that's a human thing. That's not an able person versus disabled person thing. So it's about going to the core of what our shared humanity means, and then seeing that from their perspective and from our perspective. That's what I would say.
I like that. So I asked you, this is the final question. I asked you this probably 6 months ago, and I'm going to see if it's a new answer. When you look at society broadly, what is one issue that we're not talking about enough that we should be talking about more?
Oh, boy. So I think, if we want to end on a more of a controversial note, I think that there is a lot of focus on biblical masculinity that has been taking place over the last couple of months, and I think we've done a very good job inside of our church, and I've pushed my guys very hard in this way to kind of come up with a good, like, what does being a Christian man mean? What does being a man mean generally, if we want to extrapolate it broadly? I do not hear any conversations around Christian femininity at all.
Oh.
I do not hear a vision for what women are supposed to aspire to. And I think there is a solidified version of that for masculinity now, or a increasingly solidified version of that. I don't hear that for women at all. And I saw really, again, to bring back Jordan Peterson into this conversation, he was talking with Megyn Kelly about this a couple weeks ago on his podcast. And he said something that I thought was maybe the most insightful thing I'd heard in kind of the dating sexual politics market in I've heard maybe a year. And he said, I think women are today where men were 10 years ago. No vision, no future, no role models, no influencers, no path to success or freedom. And I think that that is a very serious issue. And if we don't solve that, that's going to cause a lot of dating dynamic issues that are going to cause this divergence we're seeing with men and women to extrapolate even further.
Wow. So I forget who I was listening to. It could have been Peterson, but I can't remember. Someone talking about the difference between like men's self-help literature and women's self-help literature. And for men, it's like grind, self-improvement, be the best version of yourself, keep working to be better. And for women, it's like love yourself the way you are.
Right. Yeah. And I think honestly, like, when I was talking about this with my friend Hafiz a couple of days ago, I don't know, like, if you were to name like the top 5 guys influencers who are like, oh, as a young guy, you should maybe listen to that person and you'd probably be okay. And maybe it's because I'm a guy and I don't know, but I'm pretty plugged into the culture and I see these things. I could name 5 in 5 seconds. But for women, it's like, what I want my daughter to be like, And it's like you run out of people pretty quickly on the feminine side. And I don't know where young women I do know where young women are getting a lot of their influence from, but it's not from a lot of good places. And I think that is a very weak point of the church, is a very weak point of the culture. It's a very weak point of conservative politics. And we need to fix that, because if it's not fixed, it's going to be a very big issue. And I think we're seeing already the kind of sprouting up of that issue right now. I
would say it's probably better in our church. I feel like there's a number of female role models that like encourage women to be their best kind of thing. That's probably truer in like the broader society, but you definitely see pockets like our church where it's like, I feel like they're defying the culture in a lot of ways.
Yeah, in a way, I would agree. And I think you and I both love Ryan, and I went to the singles conference and everything, like Ryan Weckerman, shout out to him. I have his bookmark right here. And so nice. I will give Ryan some love in that. And so, but what, again, like I found that entire kind of conversation just to be very one-sided in terms of like there was no call up and call out of the women. in the church. And I think the church is a specific reason, but I think the culture is a specific reason too, or a more broad reason. But we cannot, and trust me, I have a whole book right here on why men are falling off a cliff and why we need to do better. But it's a two-side street equation as well. And I just don't see enough of that. And I think that's really harming a lot of people.
I mostly agree with you, but the little pushback that I do want to have is I think men are struggling more in the sense that there's less ambition, less direction. Like a lot of women got the boss babe thing going on. And I think the reason women became boss babes is because men were not stepping up and taking the lead. And I think when our church pushes men specifically, they're saying, get your act together, step up, embrace biblical manhood and be a leader. And I think so many men in our society have like no ambition, no vision, no goal. Their lives are spent playing video games, watching pornography. And I think men do really need a wake-up call, and I think women would adjust to that if men step up and lead.
I am not disputing that whatsoever. I think that's a great point. The way that I've broken this problem up is I believe that men have an ownership problem, to your point, about like I'm not owning my life, I'm not taking responsibility, I'm not being the best that I could be. And I think women have an honesty problem.
Go into that.
So the honesty problem is we are not honest in terms of the realities of the way that women are going in many ways. Like our pastor Doug went on this tangent on the podcast afterwards about testosterone rates. And like, I think that's why a lot of other things are there. Okay, here's a stat for you. Half of women are going to be single and childless by the age of 30 in a couple of years. And half of those women are never going to have a child. Why doesn't that stat appear on the podcast? Why don't we hear that being talked to women? Why don't we hear that a lot of modern values, not necessarily in the church, but broadly, are incompatible that young women have that young men don't desire? What I like to say recently, and I'm going to go right for the jugular here, is that there are a lot of women that are very physically attractive, but spiritually ugly.
I don't dispute any. I think there's a lot of shade that needs to be cast at women to some degree. I think it's important to get my own house in order, so to speak, like as a man, and like call out men first. Certainly there's a lot of improvement that needs to happen with women, but like as a man, why are these women single and childless? I think part of the reason is because there is not like a suitable man that a woman would trust to follow him.
Sure. In some ways, but is that always?
No.
And that's all I'm saying. I do not want to have this turn into a men bash women, women bash men. Like that has gotten us nowhere. Clearly, that's led to the manosphere. It's led to feminism. That's led to like a lot. Like it's unhelpful and it's not productive. But all that I am really looking and hoping to see and hoping to start some of this conversation is I want it to be more of like a, hey, women need to do some things too, men need to do some things too, and hopefully coming together in that way would make things a lot easier. And I think there is a lot of narrative busting on both sides that needs to kind of come to get everyone just on the same level playing field as all.
I agree with that. And yes, there's absolutely a lot of criticism that needs to happen of modern feminism, modern femininity, like the way women are going. But I think just as a general rule in nature and also in humans, women follow men. Men set the tone. Yes. And men have not been stepping up and leading. I think that's what's caused women to go the direction they have. I think the first thing that needs to happen is men to step up. And Ethan Mattat in a sermon, not that long ago.
Which, by the way, I think was the best sermon I had heard at our church in probably a year. I thought it was great. He did a great job with that.
Are you talking about the one where he said, a lot of you women might not want to... What?
Yeah. The Healthy Wife, Healthy Life sermon.
I think it was that one where he said a lot of you women might not like the idea of submitting to a man, but if you had a man step up and be a godly, biblical man, like women would be lining up to submit to that person. Like that's what I'm saying. Like,
which is correct. Yes. Yeah. Yes. Very correct. Yeah. I'm not disputing that at all. What I would like to see is I think more of like, because again, about the point about vision, I think that's the real thing that we need to have an honest conversation about, is that I think a lot of men are starting to understand that in terms of like, this is what is desirable to women. I think that's kind of lacking on the feminine side of everything else. Like this is what a woman who is aligned with that type of man is going to want, or that man is going to want out of a woman. So that's what I think is kind of going under the radar at this point. And I just think we need to bring that balance up a little bit to talk about that more.
So you said that you lead a men's Bible study or a men's small group at our church, and my brother's in your men's small group. Now, my brother's a vegan. Do you help push him towards more biblical masculinity that would involve eating meat?
Well, I mean, he's definitely more of the. I didn't know he was a vegan actually, so I think I did not. So he was definitely more of the Jacob and the Esau, Jacob and the sibling. He's definitely not the hunter killer guy. Yeah. But hey, Jacob got the birthright at the end of the day, so that was the biggest thing that kind of happened in terms of that. But no, dude, I think your brother is such a value add to our group. I absolutely love his perspective that he brings every single week. He is a leader. He is a great person to have inside of the group. He's a person that I look up to a lot. And I think that, yes, I will, he went to a steakhouse this a couple weeks ago. So that is a,
what did he order? Do you know what he ordered?
No, I don't. And so, but that also might be an op. So I'll have to ask him about that one. So that might be something that we come together.
I love my brother dearly, but I always have to give him grief about being a vegan.
Dude, now I will too. So you will have a double barrel coming at it from both angles. Yes.
Awesome. Yes. Well, Sam, thank you so much. I love it. Go out and get Spectrum of Lies. I mean, I can't wait to finish this. This is awesome. Thank you.
Thank you, brother. I appreciate you, Ryan. This is a lot of fun, dude.